Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. It's worth asking why a document written in Philadelphia in 1776 still attracts millions of visitors every year, is memorized by school children, quoted by presidents, argued by judges even today, and debated by historians 2.5 centuries later. And I think the answer is that the Declaration of Independence isn't simply America's birth certificate. It's one of the few political documents ever written that escaped its own moment in history. Most declarations actually solve an immediate crisis, and then they're actually filed away, right? This one didn't. It became a benchmark against which later generations measured liberty, equality, and of course, government itself. Even people who disagree profoundly about American history often begin with the same document. And that's why I want to talk about it today. So if we picture Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, delegates from 13 colonies are crammed into a stuffy room, arguing over words, while outside, a war that's already a year old keeps grinding on without any of them quite agreeing on what it's actually for. Are they fighting to get their old rights back as Englishmen? Or are they fighting to become something else entirely, a nation that doesn't exist yet, with no army worth the name and no guarantee anyone in Europe will actually even recognize them? You know, that question, whether to break completely with Britain, it actually took far longer to answer than you'd expect. And the story of how it finally got answered in one of the most famous documents ever written is what I want to walk you through. So the road to Lexington and Concord in 1775, well, it was the first exchange of gunfire, the one history remembers as the shot heard around the world. Honestly, it was a pretty small skirmish at the time. Then there was Patrick Henry's line delivered just before those battles: "Give me liberty or give me death." And by that summer, plenty of colonists genuinely felt that they were choosing between freedom and something close to slavery. But here's the surprising part. Even after actual fighting had started, most of these colonists were still talking about full independence. They wanted their rights back within the British Empire, not a brand new country outside it. And it's worth sitting with that just for a second, because it tells you something important about how revolutions actually happen. They very rarely ever start with the ending already decided. You know, people kind of pick up arms to defend what they believe they already have. And it's only later, often much later, do they start arguing for something entirely new. So by late 1775, something very strange was happening. The Second Continental Congress, this gathering of delegates from across the colonies, actually found itself quietly running a country it actually refused to call a country. British royal government had basically stopped functioning in most colonies by that summer. So Congress actually stepped into the gap. It appointed ambassadors. It organized what would become the Continental Army with George Washington at its head. It was acting like a national government, right down to where it raised money and coordinated defense between colonies that really, only a couple of years earlier, had barely cooperated with each other at all. And yet, while doing all of that, Congress kept insisting it wasn't trying to break from Britain. They still saw themselves as loyal Englishmen, defending rights they believed they already had, not inventing new ones. There was this persistent, almost stubborn hope that King George would eventually come to his senses, sweep away his bad advisors, and restore the colony's self-government. Rebellion against ministers, not against the crown itself. That was the story they kept telling themselves. And for a lot of delegates, walking away from that story felt less like courage and more like betrayal of everything they'd grown up believing about their place inside this British world. That hope wasn't just wishful thinking. So in July 1775, Congress made one final attempt to avoid a complete break by sending what became known as the Olive Branch Petition to King George III. And the name is very symbolic. For centuries, the olive branch had represented peace and reconciliation, and Congress was deliberately extending one last offer before events became irreversible. The petition basically affirmed the colonies' loyalty to the crown and then asked the king to intervene against what Congress saw as the destructive policies of his ministers and parliament. Yet, there was a remarkable contradiction at the heart of it all. While extending an olive branch with one hand, Congress was preparing for war with the other. George Washington had already been appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Troops were being raised, and supplies of arms and ammunition were being gathered. Congress hoped for peace, but it was no longer willing to leave the colonies defenseless while waiting for an answer. And that answer never really came. By the time the petition reached London, news of Bunker Hill had already convinced George III that the colonies were in open rebellion against him. He never formally considered their petition. Instead, on the 23rd of August, 1775, he issued his Proclamation of Rebellion, declaring the colonies to be in open revolt and calling upon his subjects to suppress the uprising. And look, I think for many moderates, it was a devastating moment. The last serious attempt at reconciliation had failed before it had even begun. The dispute was no longer simply with Parliament. It had actually become a dispute with the Crown itself. And increasingly, Americans concluded that if the king himself now regarded them as rebels, well, there was very little hope that the old relationship could ever be restored. John Adams would later become America's second president. And he made an intriguing observation that it may actually have been fortunate that the first real Declaration of Independence came from London rather than Philadelphia. By branding the colonies as rebels and accusing them of trying to, create independent empires, the British government made independence seem less like an act of ambition and more like the inevitable consequence of events. And I think into that hesitant, half-committed atmosphere dropped a pamphlet that changed the tone of the entire argument. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense, and it did something nobody else had actually quite managed. It made independence sound not just necessary, but obvious. Paine actually mocked the very idea of a small island ruling a whole continent, and he stripped away the reverence that still clung to the monarchy, even among people who were furious with the king's ministers. The pamphlet actually sold in record numbers at a time which were actually genuinely staggering. And these pamphlets were actually passed hand to hand through taverns and farms and militia camps. Paine didn't invent the case for independence. Most of the arguments were already circulating in one form or another. What he did was give ordinary people, not just the lawyers and the merchants sitting in Congress, permission to say the word independence out loud, without feeling like traitors. He wrote in plain, direct English, deliberately avoiding the Latin phrases and classical references that filled most political writing of the day. And he did it because he wanted farmers and shopkeepers to read it just as easily as lawyers could. So by the spring of 1776, the mood in the colonies had shifted in a way that would have seemed almost unthinkable just 2 months before. Newspapers reprinted long sections of his pamphlet. Preachers referenced it from the pulpit. Even some of the delegates who'd later vote for independence admitted privately that Paine's pamphlet had done more to shift public opinion than months of formal debate in Congress ever had. And here's something I think that surprises a lot of people. The Declaration of Independence, the one actually signed in July 1776, wasn't some sudden dramatic invention that arrived out of nowhere. It followed at least 90 separate local declarations of independence, written and passed in towns and communities up and down the colonies in the months before. Historians have actually traced this pattern back through local records, and the number keeps landing somewhere, around 90 distinct local statements. So I don't think it was a lightning strike. I think of the actual declaration as a culmination. It was the final version of an argument that ordinary communities had already been making for themselves again and again in slightly different words. These local declarations weren't identical, but the similarities actually outweighed their differences by far, and nearly all of them pointed to the same grievances, the so-called coercive acts. The suspension of Massachusetts' government, the crushing of local town meetings, the interruption of ordinary courts, and above all, a growing sense that Britain was treating the colonies like disobedient children instead of equal subjects. But I think also underneath all of that, sat a real fear that British power was actually turning into something militarized, something that threatened the everyday freedom of ordinary colonists. And I think what's striking about these local declarations is how democratic the whole process actually was, at least for all the free men allowed to take part in it. Town meetings debated, argued, and voted on their own statements of grievances long before anyone in Philadelphia actually put quill to paper. By the time Congress finally acted, it wasn't leading a public opinion so much as actually catching up to it. But for me, the real turning point, it isn't the 4th of July, it's actually the 2nd of July. On the 2nd of July, 1776, Congress passed a resolution stating that creating what King George himself had called an independent empire was now, officially their objective. That was the actual vote for and on independence. The declaration that followed 2 days later was, in effect, just the press release. It explained to the world why the vote on the 2nd of July had actually happened. The job of writing that explanation fell to a committee of 5 men appointed by Congress in mid-June, weeks before the actual vote. Alongside Thomas Jefferson sat John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. It's Jefferson's name that's remembered, and I think rightly so, because he did almost all the actual drafting, working through drafts in a rented room on the 2nd floor of a bricklayer's house in Philadelphia. But the committee reviewed his work, and Adams and Franklin in particular made small but meaningful edits before it ever reached the full Congress. Once the committee had its draft, Congress then spent the better part of 2 days picking it apart line by line. Jefferson, by his own later account, found the process genuinely painful. I can only imagine, sitting in near silence while other men reworded his sentences and struck out passages that he'd labored over for months. Franklin, sitting beside him, reportedly tried to lighten the mood with a story about a hat maker who kept shortening his own shop sign every time a friend suggested a cut, until almost nothing was left but his name and the picture of a hat. Congress trimmed roughly a quarter of his original text, tightening the language, and I think also in a few cases kind of softening claims that delegates felt went too far or weren't strictly accurate. It wasn't just an announcement. The document was actually framed as loyal, formal, almost ceremonial, precisely because if independence had failed, this document would have stood as clear evidence of treason. Every signer knew exactly what they were risking. Signing your name to a declaration of treason against the most powerful empire on earth, well, that wasn't a symbolic gesture. If the rebellion had collapsed, that signature was a death warrant. John Adams was so certain the vote on the 2nd of July would be remembered forever that he actually wrote home to his wife Abigail in almost giddy kind of prediction. He told her that the day would be celebrated by future generations as a great anniversary festival, marked with parades, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other forevermore. And in retrospect, he wasn't far wrong. He just had the date off by 2 days. It's the 4th, the day the declaration itself was adopted, that actually became the nation's real birthday, not the 2nd, when the actual vote took place. Adams reportedly refused invitations to the 4th of July celebrations for the rest of his life, on principle, still insisting privately that the 2nd was the date that actually mattered. One passage Congress removed is actually worth pausing on, I think, because it actually tells you something important about the limits of the whole project. Jefferson's original draft included a long, furious condemnation of the transatlantic slave trade, blaming King George for forcing it upon the colonies against their wishes. And I think it was, even by the standards of the rest of the document, extraordinarily harsh language. Congress actually struck it out entirely. Partially, this was political calculation. Delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, whose economies depended heavily on slavery, objected strongly. And northern delegates whose own merchants had profited from the slave trade, well, they weren't exactly eager to defend that passage either. So it disappeared from the final text. A reminder, I think, that the document we remember for its soaring language about equality, well, it was also, right from the drafting room, a product of very practical, very unequal compromise. A large part of the Declaration, honestly, the largest part by word count, is a long list of grievances against King George III. Jefferson wrote that the king's character was marked by every act that could define a tyrant, unfit to be the ruler of a free people. But I'm going to go on record here as saying I don't think George III was actually a tyrant. In fact, I'm going to say absolutely he wasn't a tyrant in any kind of historical sense. He came to the throne very young in 1760, genuinely engaged with the business of government, and he respected the constitutional settlement Britain had reached after its own glorious revolution some decades earlier. But he took his responsibility as king of the whole British Empire extremely seriously, and by 1775, he'd completely lost patience with the colonies. He'd become convinced that only a firm show of force would actually settle matters. And look, there's a real irony buried in this. If George III had genuinely been the tyrant that Jefferson described, Britain likely had more than enough military and naval power in the 1770s to crush the rebellion outright. The fact that America won its independence at all suggests that the king wasn't willing, or maybe he wasn't able, to go anywhere near as far as a true tyrant would have gone. But that's not the reputation history remembers. Jefferson's phrase and Thomas Paine's fiery pamphleteering, go hand in hand, and they fix the image of George III as a tyrant in the American imagination for good, an image, I guess, that's proven remarkably durable, showing up in American classrooms more than 2 centuries later, almost unchanged. Grievances make up most of the document, but they're not what it's remembered for. What's remembered is the opening. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Altadomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altadomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270, or visit their website, penangmyhome.com. And we're back. The final text begins in narrative form, explaining almost apologetically why the colonists feel forced to act. And it draws very heavily on ideas rooted in English political tradition, especially the philosopher John Locke's writing on government. It actually opens up with the famous line about when, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands connecting them to another. Then comes the sentence everyone can half recite from memory, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed with certain unalienable rights, among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think it's actually worth pausing on what Jefferson actually meant by that, because it's not what many people assume today. He wasn't declaring literal equality between all people. He meant equality in the eyes of God. More specifically, he meant equality among white heads of households, free from tyrannical government, free from religious oppression. These rights in his framing were God-given, natural, and innate. Nobody could strip them away. The argument that follows rests on classical social contract theory, and that's straight out of Locke. Governments exist to secure these rights. Their authority comes from the consent of the governed. And when a government stops protecting those rights, the people have the right to abolish it and build a new one. The claim being made wasn't that America was inventing brand new freedoms. It was that Americans already possessed these rights as their birthright, and that the king's government had simply stopped honoring them. That framing actually, when you think about it, it matters enormously, because it let the delegates present themselves as conservatives, defending an existing inheritance, and not radicals inventing something that had been completely untested. Even the most revolutionary document in American history was, at least in its own telling, an act of restoration rather than invention. The document Congress approved on the 4th of July wasn't the elegant, calligraphized sheet that you actually see in the textbooks and on classroom posters today. That printed version, rushed out overnight by the Philadelphia printer John Dunlap, was plain type on paper, meant for speed and distribution, not for display. The famous engrossed copy, the one with the large flowing signatures, wasn't actually finished and signed by most delegates until the 2nd of August, literally nearly a month later. 56 men eventually put their names to that document. Some, like Hancock and Adams, are still household names. Others are barely remembered outside specialist history. All of them, though, on that page, were putting their necks quite literally on the line. Once finished, the declaration wasn't just filed away. Copies were actually printed to fit onto a single broadsheet, deliberately trimmed so that they could be posted and read aloud easily. And they went out to every colony. People gathered to hear it read from courthouse steps and from town squares because there was no other way. Crucially, George Washington actually ordered it read aloud in full to the entire Continental Army, who were gathered in New York just as a massive British invasion fleet was arriving in the harbor. And I can only imagine that was as tense a setting as you could ever get. So not just the famous opening lines that we all know today, but the long list of grievances too. And the purpose, I think, was twofold. Continental soldiers needed reminding why they were enduring the hardship of a military campaign. So the anger and the grievances, well, they actually mattered. But they also needed the loftier ideals in those opening paragraphs, the sense that they weren't simply resisting something, that they were actually fighting for something, freedom, equality, a set of values that were worth the sacrifice. Any long war, and this is something that the Americans need to realize, need both of those ingredients. fear and hope together. In New York, soldiers and civilians reportedly celebrated by pulling down, a large equestrian statue of George on horseback, melting much of it down afterwards to make musket balls. And I think that's a fairly blunt piece of symbolism, if ever I heard of one. The king's own image, quite literally recast as ammunition being fired at his own soldiers. I think it's also worth remembering that the declaration wasn't only, or even primarily, aimed at Britain or at the American public. A huge part of its intended audience actually sat across the Atlantic in the courts of Europe, and especially in Paris. France had actually lost badly to Britain in the 7 Years' War barely more than a decade earlier, and French ministers were watching the American rebellion with obvious, barely disguised interest. A formal declaration, one that carefully laid out legal and philosophical justification, rather than simply announcing armed resistance, well, I think that gave France something it could actually work with diplomatically. It let sympathetic figures at the French court argue that this wasn't a lawless rebellion, but a legitimate people asserting their rights under natural law. And that's exactly the kind of language that European diplomacy of the era took incredibly seriously. Benjamin Franklin would sail for Paris later that same year to press precisely that case. And the eventual French alliance, without which the war may not have been won, owed something to the careful, deliberate tone Congress had insisted on this particular document. Officially, the British government didn't respond to the declaration at all, because acknowledging it would have meant admitting that the Continental Congress was a legitimate body. As far as London was concerned, that Congress was simply an illegal body with no standing whatsoever. Unofficially, though, I think reactions were overwhelmingly negative. British writers disputed the individual grievances one by one, and conservative voices actually reacted with real disbelief at the famous opening paragraphs. The radical philosopher Jeremy Bentham dismissed them outright. He called them absurd and visionary, nothing but glittering phrases with no real connection to how actual governments worked. And beneath that, he saw a list of grievances that he thought were highly disputable. In his view, it simply wasn't a serious document of government. Samuel Johnson had already been sharpening a very similar line of attack even before July 1776, famously wondering aloud how the loudest yelps for liberty came from the drivers of enslaved people. And you know what? I think that's a genuinely uncomfortable question. And it's one the Declaration itself, for all its soaring language, doesn't answer. And here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because the intentions of the people who wrote the Declaration turned out to matter far less than how it was used afterward. Most of the signers, including Jefferson himself, were slaveholders. When Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he certainly didn't mean that enslaved people were equal to him or his peers. That much is actually very clear from his own life and his own writing, which still survive. But almost immediately after the Declaration was signed and printed and then read aloud, enslaved people began using its own language to argue for their own freedom. And this wasn't a generation later, this wasn't a decade later, it was actually within a year or two, where there were court cases in Massachusetts where enslaved people cited the Declaration's own words to sue for their liberty. One of the best known, brought by a woman later known as Elizabeth Freeman, well, she actually helped push Massachusetts courts towards finding slavery incompatible with the state's own constitution. And I think that's also the strange power of this document. It became almost instantly a tool that could be turned against the very inequalities its authors had lived with and quietly accepted. So 250 years on, and we've just seen that celebration take place in the United States, the Declaration still looms enormously large over American political life. And its afterlife, I think, is arguably just as interesting as the summer that actually produced it. Take the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, the founding moment of the American women rights movement. The organizers didn't write a fresh manifesto from scratch. There was no point. They wrote a declaration of sentiments, deliberately mirroring Jefferson's structure almost line for line, right down to the opening with "when" in the course of human events. Where Jefferson had written a list of grievances against King George, the Seneca Falls Declaration listed grievances against men in general, effectively borrowing the Declaration's own authority to make its case. Frederick Douglass, born enslaved and later one of the great orators of the 19th century, delivered a speech in 1852 that's still taught today, asking pointedly what the 4th of July truly meant to the enslaved. He didn't reject the Declaration's ideals. He insisted America simply hadn't lived up to them yet, and that the gap between the promise on the page and the reality of slavery was the nation's deepest hypocrisy. Abraham Lincoln actually leaned on it heavily during the Civil War. At Gettysburg in 1863, he opened not by referencing the Constitution, which, after all, had accommodated slavery directly, but by reaching back to 1776 instead, 77 years ago, grounding the entire war effort in the Declaration's promise that all men are created equal. And I think that's a deliberate choice. And it shifted the Declaration's meaning permanently, turning it from a document about independence into a document increasingly read as being about equality itself. Martin Luther King, nearly a century later, he did very much the same thing, describing the Declaration and the Constitution together as a promissory note that America had, for its black citizens, actually defaulted on. Each time, the same handful of lines get reused, reinterpreted, and turned into an argument for expanding exactly the equality Jefferson himself had never intended to include everyone in. And look, the influence didn't stay inside America's own borders either. In September 1945, on a rainy day in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh stood before a crowd and read out Vietnam's own Declaration of Independence from French colonial rule. He opened it by quoting Jefferson directly, that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, before turning those same words against the very kind of colonial power that the young United States had once thrown off itself. And I think that's a genuinely striking moment. A document written in 1776 to justify one rebellion against one empire being read aloud 170 years later and half a world away to justify another. Jefferson never imagined his words traveling quite that far, I'm sure. And yet there they were, doing exactly the same work they'd always done, giving people without power a shared, borrowed language for demanding it. So what was it really? Step back and I see the Declaration of Independence for what it actually was. It wasn't a bolt from nowhere. It was a polished, formal accumulation of 90 local declarations, a mountain of accumulated grievance, careful diplomatic calculation aimed at Paris as much as London, and one very deliberate piece of political theater designed to turn treason into principled rebellion, if you like, aimed at watching European powers as much as the king himself. And yet I think the opening lines actually outgrew all of that. A document written by slaveholding men meant to justify their own political independence, it became something else entirely, almost against the author's wishes. It turned into a permanent invitation for everyone else to ask the same question. What about us? That tension between what the Declaration's authors meant in 1776 and what generations after them insisted it must mean, it's still very much alive today. It's arguably the document's most lasting legacy of all, more durable in the end than any of the specific grievances it was written to actually settle. And I think there's also something worth sitting here with before I move on. Most founding documents get treated as finished things, fixed in stone, meant to be read exactly the way their authors intended and no further. The Declaration never really got that luxury. Within years of it being signed, it was already being pulled in directions its own authors hadn't planned for, and in Jefferson's case, almost certainly wouldn't have welcomed. And look, that's not really a flaw in the document. If anything, it might be the reason it survived at all. A document that could only ever mean one fixed thing would have aged very badly. It would have been tied forever to 1776 and to men who owned other human beings while writing about liberty. Instead, because the language was broad enough and also bold enough, later generations kept finding new and completely legitimate uses for it, stretching those opening lines further than Jefferson's own quill had ever intended them to go. 250 years is but the briefest moment in the life of a civilization. Egypt lasted millennia. Rome believed itself eternal. The British Empire once governed a quarter of the world. Each stood at the height of its power, convinced that its future would look very much like its past. Each was wrong. The Declaration of Independence gave birth to one of history's greatest political experiments, but no experiment succeeds forever simply because it once succeeded brilliantly. Every nation eventually reaches the moment when it has to decide whether it still believes in the principles that created it, or whether comfort, division, and complacency have quietly replaced them. I'll finish with this. There's an old truth that echoes through every ruined city on earth. Those who built them never imagined they were laying the foundations for ruins. They believed their laws, their wealth, their armies, and their ideals would actually carry them forever. They were wrong. Time is patient, history is absolutely merciless, and no civilization has ever negotiated an exemption from either. 250 years ago, America proclaimed an idea that changed the world. Whether that idea survives another 250 years isn't a question that can be answered today. But I think it will be answered by those who inherit what this generation leaves behind. If history has taught us anything, folks, it's that the greatest danger to a republic is not the enemy beyond its borders, but the moment it ceases to recognize itself and the rights of its citizens. Happy 250th anniversary, America. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.